Dear church, let's talk about faith and comedy. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church Podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Really excited about my guest today. You know, every week I say I've got my good friend so-and-so on here. Jacob, we don't know each other, but I've been following you from afar. And I just thought, man, this guy would be really interesting to have on the program. And, you know, if it flops, I'm going to blame you, but I think it's going to be great.
That's okay. I take a lot of criticism as a preacher and as a comic, so I'm used to it.
Yeah, so I let our viewers and listeners know, this is Jacob Parnell. He's out in Livermore, California. Tri-Cities, is that the name of the Church of Christ?
The Tri-Valley Church of Christ. Yeah, right here in
Tri-Valley. Sorry. Right there in Livermore. And in addition to being the preacher at the Tri-Valley Church of Christ, you are also a stand-up comic. And funny, because I've said this before, I think Christian movies and Christian comedy, it's kind of hard to get into for a lot of us because it seems to be, you know, a lot of times just corny and, you know, especially the movies, the acting's not great and all of that. But you're actually really funny. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about how people can tune in and kind of see you and your routine. But talk a little bit about just you first. Give our listeners and viewers some insight into who you are, your family, the church there, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And thank you for saying I'm funny. That's the goal on the comedy side of things. Definitely. But yeah, I'm a preaching minister at the Tri-Valley Church of Christ. I've been at the same congregation for almost 15 years now.
Wow.
I moved here with my wife and no kids at the time to do youth ministry and did a full-time youth and young adults ministry role for 7 years. And then I transitioned into the preaching role at the same congregation, which is its own set of challenges. People who've done that or known people who've done that, that's can be an interesting transition, but it's been really smooth. And I've been preaching here for the last 8 years full-time. And then about 3 years ago, I started writing stand-up comedy and going to open mics in the area and just, you know, finding out if what you said is true. Like, is this just funny in my head or can I actually make a crowd of strangers laugh? And the first few times were rough, but had some promise. And then I got better. And now I do about one show a week, whether it's an open mic or a showcase or get invited to do a show at a winery or a theater or a restaurant or whatever, but I'm still kind of keeping up with the comedy and trying to be funny.
Is this something that you've dreamed about doing? Is this something that's been a lifelong pursuit or just something that you did on a whim and realized, hey, I'm pretty good at this?
That's a good question. In a sense, it's kind of always been around me. Like I grew up in a household with just my mom was a single mom, but she loved comedy. Like we watched all the sitcoms on NBC and just like Tuesday, Thursday evening television in the 90s. Like anybody who was doing the best stand-ups who made it onto the Tonight Show were often given a pilot, and a lot of the sitcoms from the 90s came from stand-ups, you know, like Tim Allen and Seinfeld, Brett Butler, and Roseanne, and just, the list goes on. And my mom was really into that, so I grew up watching her enjoy that. I kind of developed a taste for sitcoms, and then she would also buy their books like Sign Language and, you know, Drew Carey's book and Tim Allen's Don't Stand Too Close to a Naked Man. Like we had all of that in our house. So she would read it and she'd hand it to me and say, this is hilarious. So I kind of learned about stand-up specifically from a young age. And then in high school, I had a buddy who wanted to try it. Like he wanted to go into some comedy clubs up in Seattle where I lived at the time. And he was nervous and he's like, okay, I want you to like write some comedy too and open for me. So now I had this excuse to try to write some jokes, see if I could make a crowd laugh. I did it twice and kind of like what I said before, it was rough, but there was some promise and I enjoyed it. So, and then I didn't do comedy for years and years and just focused on ministry. And then, you know, the itch is sort of always there. I think all preachers tell a good story from the pulpit and get a good reaction from the congregation, kind of have that, you know, I wonder, you see a stand-up on Netflix and go, I wonder if I could do this, you know, in a club or in a bar or like where comedy specifically is happening. But not that many try it out. And that's kind of what I did. I tried it out and just tried to get better. And it's been a fun hobby.
Do you find that that there's a lot of similarities? Because I have said this often. I enjoy stand-up comedy. I really love Nate Bargatze and Jerry Seinfeld. And one of the things with Seinfeld is he's very into the analytical side and the craft. and he talked about maybe teaching a class at a university about stand-up, because when he's going through the different things that he does in order to prepare and to put together a joke and deliver a joke, I'm thinking a lot of that is very similar to what I do in preparation for a sermon. Have you found that to be true, that there is a lot of similarities between those two occupations?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And Seinfeld's a great example, because you see any interviews or you hear other comics talk about Seinfeld, they're like, he is a workhorse. He will take a bit, and even if it gets the best reaction ever, he'll still edit it and he'll refine it and he'll play with the wording. Most comics that you see on Netflix with their specials, people think, man, they're amazing. Like, how can they do this? But what people don't realize is that they've been workshopping these jokes at clubs and just their workout spaces where they go and do comedy. They'll do like 4 shows a night in New York City and places where there's a ton of comedy. These are well-refined bits. Like, they've done these jokes 100 to 200 times before you ever see them filmed on a special. And you're like, wow, these guys are pros. Well, they're pros because they work at it. And so there is some similarity in that. In preaching, there's got to be a craft. Like, you got to know where you're going. You maybe want to edit your first draft or write things out or run them through a few times. But what I found is that the difference in comedy is, like I said, you could do it like 100 or 200, 300 times and get it perfect. Not all preachers have the luxury of doing that, because, you know, you're writing a sermon for one Sunday and then the next Sunday comes, you got to start working on the next one. So unless you're preaching, multiple services, or if you're a preacher that's got like a traveling sermon that you get to do again and again and again, that's where the similarities kind of split. But I've also found that there's a lot of overlap, not just in the crafting of a sermon versus like a stand-up comedy routine. But what I found in performing to strangers is I've learned to be concise. I don't know if you could tell from me rambling here early in the morning on a Monday. But in stand-up, like, you can't put in details from a story that are unnecessary. Like, you've got to get to the point. You got to say just enough that's necessary for the setup and the punchline. You got to get the laugh, and you got to move on. And so, surprisingly, I've learned some lessons from comedy about how to be concise in my preaching, kind of like editing. Definitely don't say anything you don't need to say. Don't bore the audience. Being engaging up front. In stand-up comedy, you got about 10 seconds to win over the audience. They're going to decide right away if they like you or not. Preachers, you baptize their kids, and you've done hospital visits. They love you already. They want you to talk for like 20, 40 minutes. Stand-up is the exact opposite. They're like, you better prove yourself, or we're not going to let you stick around. We're going to start looking at our phones. And so it's just been interesting. Doing more stand-up and putting myself in an environment that's not the same as church has kind of given me some tools and principles that have made my preaching sharper.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, because I feel like there's probably no more vulnerable position than to be in front of an audience that is expecting something great and just waiting to say, hey, entertain us, make us laugh. And that's a lot of pressure. What are some of the ways in which that kind of atmosphere has helped you in your preaching?
Ooh, yeah. Well, one way is that it puts you in an environment where you're not beloved. You're not like the vocal person. Preachers can get very comfortable being like a church leader or just the person that gets the time every Sunday. You have to kind of get over that. You can't take forever to settle in with your notes and like give these long intros. Oh man, it was traffic on the way here. Like, nobody cares. You got to get to the point. But it's really healthy, I think, for Christians, not just preachers, but all Christians. We tend to put ourselves in this bubble where everybody speaks the same language and everybody knows everybody. We can become very insulated within our churches. Going to even just an open mic at a local bar or restaurant, like, you got to remember, oh man, like, I don't know these people. You got to turn on some of those social skills. You got to like defer to the people who are in charge. You got to let somebody else lead. I think that's healthy, because putting yourself in an environment where you are an outsider, and then you go back to your congregation, you know what it's like to have somebody not explain the rules to you, or not explain the language, or to, have made a mistake, and you want people to be gracious to you. You take that into the church, you start to see things better from an outsider's perspective. And that's when we can do really good hospitality and not just, turn ourselves toward the people we were hoping to talk to, but just be a better, welcoming community. That's one thing that I found, and just putting myself out there, and like, there's nothing that makes you more uncomfortable, even for a professional speaker who is comfortable in front of audiences. than just to get up in front of a bunch of strangers and say, man, like, I hope this goes well. Please be gentle. If people have ever just thought about, like, I wonder if I can make people laugh. I encourage people all the time, like, go find out, because even if you don't, it will teach you some good lessons that people who want to emulate, like the love and the grace of Jesus, will learn really, really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, is this a ministry, Jacob? I mean, do the people that you are, performing in front of, do they know your background? Do they know that you're a preacher? Does that help? Does that hurt? I mean, how much of a transfer from one to the other is there when you're doing stand-up comedy?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first started doing stand-up, I didn't want to be pigeonholed as like the Christian comic or pastor in the room talking about communion trays and that kind of stuff. Like you said, it can't be
right.
It can be a little corny, and you're speaking a language that people don't know. A lot of stand-up is just like finding themes that people can relate to and recognize. And if a large part of your audience are not churchgoers, then it's not going to land. So I not only wasn't doing material about church or talking about being a pastor, I was kind of keeping that to myself because I wanted to find out if I could be good at stand-up kind of on like stand-up's terms. But then I realized that a big part of stand-up is just being authentic to who you are. And like one guy early on when I was doing stand-up, he's like, your jokes are funny, but anybody can be funny. People want to like know who you are. They want to know that you're being authentic and honest. And he actually told me, he's like, go read Joe Coy's book, like the Filipino American comic, who, a lot of people know him. He's got some specials, but he was a Def Jam comic for a long time. And he did the clubs and he did the circuits and he was doing fine. Like he was being successful. But what he says in his book is once he started leaning into the material about being Filipino and stuff about his mom and like doing his mom's voice and all of that, he said that's when he really found his audience and his comedy got elevated because people were like, this is who you are. And like, we can relate to this. And so we like you even more. Like, you're not just funny, but you're funny. You have a story to tell. And the guy was saying, you're not really being true to who you are. And of course I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. Grumble, grumble. But then after I reflected on it, I went, okay, maybe there's something there. And my buddy, Brian Shackman, who is a preacher in the Church of Christ, but also does stand up. He says, I have a bit about being a pastor and I just include it in my set. And what I find is that almost every show, someone comes up to me afterward and says like, oh, is that true? Like, where do you preach? Where do you minister? So I started doing that. I wrote just a couple bits that weren't no agenda, not like, all right, now here comes the Jesus segment and it's half sermon and half stand up. It's just more a couple quips about being a pastor. And then I found that what Brian said is 100% happened for me as well. People started saying, oh, I used to go to church, or, oh, where's your congregation? We just moved to town and we're looking for a place to worship. All kinds of stuff, and if this is happening in an environment where people have been like having a couple drinks, which is usually the case in stand-up comedy, people tend to get kind of open. Like people just come up to you and start talking about hurts from the past. You kind of instantly become the chaplain of the open mic or the comedy night. And so once I started, that's kind of how I see it as a ministry. I've told people I'm kind of the unofficial chaplain. Like, it's a ministry of presence. I'm there. I try to make my material clean and family friendly. And, I don't, there's some like low hanging fruit in comedy, like talking about my wife nags me so much. My kids are so annoying. I try to go against the grain a little bit and use it as an opportunity to say like, man, I love my kids. They're like a joy in my life. My wife is actually really, really smart and I'm blessed to have her. And so if I can include those positive themes that reflect my Christian worldview in a scene, but then still just doing the work and crafting good stand-up bits, I find that I'm gaining credibility and people know that I'm a Christian, and hasn't been a problem. I haven't really found people kind of shying away from it. You get the occasional like, sorry, pastor, my bits are not that clean over here.
Yeah.
Keep going. Do your jokes.
Yeah. Don't apologize to me, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Jacob, let me ask you this. This is my second career, I was a high school coach, and I always said coaching and Christianity conflicted many times. It was hard to be a Christian sometimes and be a coach. Really? And I've got a good friend right now that's trying to make it in the country music business, and he says the same thing. You're where you have to go to play in order to get noticed, or bars and honky tonks and things like that. And so he talks about the conflict with that sometimes. Is there a rub? Have you noticed a conflict that you have to overcome when comedy versus Christianity, or have you been able to meld the two pretty well and it's not an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on bills, or I've been on comedy shows before where I'm clearly the mismatch. Like, it depends on who's booking the show, but sometimes it'll be just, like filthy comic, filthy comic, filthy comic, filthy comic. And then Jacob talking about going to the dentist, and then a filthy comic. And, even if my stuff is good, even if it sounds, it tends to be a little bit of a mismatch. That might be the part in the set where the people go to the restroom or go outside and check their phones or something like that. So it's not always a good fit. But, I mean, like you said, Nate Bargatze is just like at the top of his game, and he's one of the most well-respected comics, like just family-friendly, clean, being himself, just doing good comedy. I think that sort of speaks for itself. I do. There are a lot of shows where the content is really blue, just really rough. Comedy has, like I said, some of it is authenticity. People are just like telling whatever is in their head, like unfiltered. And when it comes to like a show that people are paying to see, that's one level of filter, is like, it's got to be good. You have to have been vetted by someone who's going to like screen out a lot of the cringy stuff. But when it comes to open mics, like, that's just all you got to do to get on a microphone for 5 minutes and say whatever is in your crazy brain, is write your name on a piece of paper, and they'll let you up there. So I learned early on, I don't invite my elders to the open mic shows. They're not gonna love it. But they've seen some of my performances in theaters or places where it's a little bit more like, all right, these people have put some thought into it. And even if there's profanity or just material that's about things related to the lower half of your body, then I sort of go, all right, that's to be expected. But I don't always. I try to come in with a disclaimer, like, this is not going to be for everybody. You're not going to have a good evening if you pay. There's a sweet old lady at my church. She's probably in her mid-80s, and she's so sweet and kind. And she's on Facebook, and she saw an advertisement for one of my shows, and it was me and 2 other comics. And she said, "Oh, I'm going to go out." And so she paid $40 for a ticket to sit. I was first, and she saw my set, and she said, "Oh, I was so good. I was so proud of you." And then the next 2 comics were just really raunchy, and she sat through it. She caught when they were done, and she's, "I didn't like that at all. I did not enjoy that, but you were fun. I'm glad that I got to see you." And I said, "Yeah, I'm really sorry about that." So I kind of have had to reconcile those things, and I often don't enjoy people being unfiltered, and just, there's a lot of darkness in comedy, people working through some hurts or some anger or relationship stuff, or just, trying stuff out and seeing if anybody else can relate to that. But when I was a youth minister, we would do talent shows, or when a student would get up and preach a lesson or something like that. One principle that I revert back to is I try to be encouraging, and it takes a lot of guts to get up in front of people. And, we're all imperfect, and we're all like seeing what works and what doesn't work. And sometimes you have to embarrass yourself in front of people, or just say something terrible, and the response is silence. And that is painful. Yeah. And so I know what that's like. And so when someone's up there trying something out, I try to listen. I try not to. A lot of comics will just be there for their own set, and then they'll just talk to other comics out on the patio, and they're like, "Oh, it's my turn," and then, leave the amateurs or the new folks to perform to empty rooms. I try to be there. I try to be present. I try to encourage people. I try not to give too much advice, but afterwards there's kind of a culture of sharing notes with comics, like, "Hey, you might want to tweak this one," or, "Hey, this wording could be a little bit different." So just to try to let people know, "Hey, I see you, and good try, keep at it," kind of thing, and try to set a good example, and just sort of see what comes of it.
No, I think that's great. And I can't imagine, kind of the paths that this has taken you, and where it's led you, and probably some of it really cool. You've talked about some of the negatives, but I'm sure there's really some positives as well. And I think that, the other side of what we've been talking about is you can be a light in the dark. I mean, that's what we're called to be, right? And so with your comedy, sprinkled in with all of the negativity and the unfiltered and all that, I'm sure that it can be quite refreshing. I don't remember what comedian it was. It may have been Nate Bargatze, but he said, Henry Cho or one of them said he was talking to Seinfeld one time, and Jerry told him, when he was talking about being clean and not using profanity and all that, and Jerry said, why would you have a bit, or why would you have a set that you couldn't do on national television without having to censor it completely to where it's not funny anymore? I mean, in other words, the idea was, why would your comedy not be for everyone so that it could reach the masses and you could do it anywhere? And I thought, well, that's an interesting take, and one that makes sense to me, because obviously I like that kind of comedy versus the other. I feel like that there is a sense where you can be a light in a dark world or a dark space.
Yeah. And, one of the guiding verses that I kind of go by is 1 Peter 2, where he talks about live such good life among the unbelievers that even if they accuse you of doing wrong, your words and your actions kind of speak for themselves. And that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to be competent and by a comic's terms, I want to make all audiences laugh, whether it's a bar crowd or a theater crowd or all ages kind of thing. I just want to do well. It's what I found too is that you get booked on shows and comics are not always taking it seriously. A lot of the comics that are younger or they just they won't show up on time. So there's something to be said for saying, yes, I'll be at this show and I will do 7 minutes and not 10 minutes, and just being true to what you said you would do. I'm for me, it seems like that's common sense and basic human courtesy. But other shows where half the comics don't show up. There's a producer going, man, the comics aren't here yet. Can you do? You said you do 15, but can you do 25 because we're waiting for somebody to get here on time. I don't know if they have I don't know if they'll be here at all. So I'm trying to be a light in a lot of different ways by doing a good job, doing it well, being ready, being flexible, being personable, and just making people glad that they booked me and have a good experience. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah. Where does your inspiration come from, Jacob, when you're writing jokes and when you're trying to come up with new material? Where does it come from? I know that as a preacher, people ask me, where do you come up with your sermons? And I say, very easy. I just look around. You pay attention. You keep a little notebook and write stuff down. I have a notebook beside my bed. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and write something down, because if you pay attention long enough, you're going to catch something that can help you. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely daily life. I have 5 daughters and they're all age 13 and under. So that script,
oh wow,
it kind of writes itself. Sometimes I just repeat the things my kids say and do. But a lot of it is, it's the what if situations in life. I was thinking the other day, about I started seeing a therapist and just kind of working through some things and sorting some things out. And I was on my way to meet my friends for this weekly meeting that we have. And they're 2 close buddies of mine. They're both preachers. And I was thinking on the way there, oh, you know what? I get to tell them that I started seeing a therapist. And then immediately I thought, wait a minute. If you tell your closest friends that you're going to see a therapist, does that confirm that they're not doing their job? Doesn't that mean that your friends aren't doing a good job of listening and giving you good advice? You have to pay a professional to do this. So that just kind of occurred to me as I was on my way. Should I tell them? Should I not tell them? And then I went, oh, that's a bit. You could develop that. You could give some examples of what that's like. But yeah, it's the thoughts that you have and you go, ooh, that's kind of interesting and relatable. A lot of it too is what I should have said. If you have an encounter with somebody says something a little off the wall or surprising, and then you just kind of go, oh, okay, yeah. And then you walk away. Later on that afternoon, you'll go, hey, it would have been funny. What if I had said this? Or that would have been unconventional if I had said this. And that makes a really good bit if you just recreate a situation in your life and don't say what you actually did, but say what you thought of doing. What if I had said this? And
right.
A lot of the material just kind of grows out of imagining just the weirdest, most awkward conversation.
Yes.
So, yeah, a little bit from churches, a little bit from family life, and just kind of the encounters you have with people.
Well, I've listened to sermons of yours, and it's definitely not a stand-up routine. I mean, it's very good. And I wonder, when you when you go to the pulpit, how much comedy do you inject? do seem much more serious there than you do in your stand-up routine, which you would want, right? I mean, that's, it needs to be that way, I would think. But I mean, I'm sure there's more comedy and lightheartedness injected. And we were talking about this before we came on air with our producer in here, is that, I think it's a generational thing, but there are some folks that have thought that, church needs to be solemn, almost funereal in the way that it's done. And so when you inject humor, or even when there's some lightheartedness, it's like, well, this makes me uncomfortable. And I guess there's always an extreme, right, in either direction. But you mentioned authenticity, and I think that's huge, because I know of preachers who, they get up and it's like a caricature, or they become another person. And I relate to preachers that are authentic and just being themselves. So I guess that's a whole ball there that I'm asking you to unravel. But when it comes to preaching, how much of this is injected into that?
Yeah. A lot of people ask me that. They're like, okay, you do stand-up. Does that mean if I come and see you on a Sunday morning, I'm going to get a 30-minute comedy routine with some Bible verses injected? Definitely not, because there's two different goals in preaching and in stand-up. In stand-up, the goal is real simple.
Yeah.
You want a reaction from the crowd, preferably a laugh.
Yeah.
But I think Chris Rock said, a groan is just as good as a laugh, but silence is your enemy. So you're trying to connect to people, get them to care, and try to make them laugh, try to entertain. Preaching is different. You're trying to bring a word from the Lord. You're trying to bring a word of truth, and you're trying to equip and encourage your congregation. And so that's the main goal in preaching, and I stick to that. But just the way my brain works and the way that I incorporate storytelling into my preaching, sometimes things just come across naturally as funny. Like if I'm using something from my home life, one of those darndest things that one of my young kids said, then that's going to be funny, and people are going to laugh at that. And I'm blessed to be in a congregation that they know my personality by this time. They're okay with laughing at some things, but they know that I'm not just trying to tickle their funny bone and win their approval. They know it's going somewhere. Yeah. And I think that's part of what makes the difference. Is if you're a preacher and you're up there just trying to do what a stand-up comedian is doing, then you probably are missing something and not letting the Lord and the Holy Spirit speak through you. I love what Michael Jr. says. Yeah. Michael Jr. is another one of my favorite comics, and he's a Christian. Yeah. He says his comedy changed when he went from thinking, I got to go up here in front of a crowd when I'm doing comedy, and I got to get laughs. He said he made this shift to, I go up there with the mindset, I'm going to give laughs. My job is to entertain, is to lighten the load in someone's life and just make them have a really good time. And when he changed that mindset from how well can I get all those laughs there for me? They make me feel good. It's more of a ministry. It's more about serving others and saying, no, I'm going to try to give as many laughs as possible. I think that's a good principle to take into the stand-up side of things. But then it applies too in the preaching side, where you can say, my goal is to serve the congregation and to say something that is meaningful and lasting, that will stick in their brains and help them become more formed in the image of Jesus Christ. And comedy is just kind of incidental. If it happens along the way, then that's good. But I'm rarely aiming for this part is going to get a big chuckle and I'm going to hang out here and draw as many reactions as I can. But I think my experience in youth ministry has made it one of the principles that I've tried to live by is just being engaging. It's not about getting laughs or being entertaining, but engaging, I think, is crucial for a young audience, especially a screen generation that's like, I could be anywhere else right now. I don't have to listen to this. So I think I naturally have crafted my public presentations, my speeches, classes, lessons with youth to just be engaging and to bring out the interesting and engaging parts of Scripture. I've got this plaque on my wall somewhere here in the church building, and it says, if you think following Jesus is boring, then you're probably not doing it right. And that's something I try to engage the students with and say, oh, there's so much goodness here. Let's just give it the respect that it's due. This is the gospel. This is life-giving. And I take that into the pulpit as well. And along the way, there's just a lot of space for joy. I'll say one more thing about it, because you prompted something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this.
Absolutely.
And part of that, what I find I get a lot of positive feedback in my preaching is when I'm confessional. And when I say, this is what Jesus calls us to, but I'm honestly I failed. I lost it with my family this week. I was not a peacemaker.
Yeah.
I was not gracious. I held this grudge and I was not forgiving. Almost every time that I'm bold enough to offer that from the pulpit, somebody will come up and say, I'm glad you said that, because sometimes I think, like, here's the preacher and he's got his act together. Here's all these church people and we're all just like showcasing how good and how like on the narrow path we are. But when you said, I failed this week, or I'm trying, this is the target I'm aiming for and I don't always hit it, it made me feel a little relieved and like I can keep going and I'm not just a huge failure. And so being confessional from the pulpit is really, really valuable. And a big part of stand-up comedy, like I said, even with the raunchy stuff, even with like the I'm a failure stuff, Nate Bargatze's whole like, I'm dumb, I didn't go very far in college kind of thing. It's relatable. People just go like, okay, good. Like I can be comfortable. We all don't have to be perfect here. And I think that's a cool crossover.
You're absolutely right. I and everything you just said, because I relate best to Nate Bargatze because he's like me. He's just a regular guy. And I think that, a preacher standing up and disseminating information and, you need to listen to me because I've got this figured out. I mean, that never works, right? I mean, not as well as a preacher that's authentic to say, look, I'm preaching to myself first, right? I think that's huge. I think that's key to being effective. And, Jacob, I know you do, your stand-up comedy, I know you do for churches, and you are willing to come and do that for churches, obviously not during the sermon on Sunday morning, but like as an event. And so tell us, as we kind of wrap things up and put a bow on it, tell us how people can find you to listen to your routine, also maybe to listen to sermons, but, tell us a little bit about having churches bring you in for an event.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for saying that. I'm on Instagram, Jacob Parnell Comedy. I think that's my YouTube handle as well. Also, you can find me on Facebook, but Instagram has some short clips of some of the performances that I've done. You kind of get a flavor for my jokes. My buddy Chris Goldman up in Seattle at the Northwest Church, he hired me to come up this summer. He's like, here's what we're going to do. Saturday night, we're going to do a public offering, just open up the church facility, the Family Life Center for comedy. And we're going to have you do a full set, and we'll just say, invite your friends and neighbors. So I did that. I did a comedy set Saturday night. And while I was in town, he had me guest preach that Sunday morning. And then he had a volunteer appreciation dinner that Sunday night. And I was the entertainment for that as well. So I did 2 different comedy sets, church Saturday night, Sunday night, and then guest preached on Sunday morning. And so, I'm always up for traveling to new churches, spending time with ministers and offering that as a service. But yeah, check out my material really cool. Online. The church, on YouTube, we're Tri-Valley Church, our YouTube channel, and all of our worship services and sermons are there too.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us today. Thank you for what you're doing, and really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be with us and to get up early because you're in California. We're recording at 9, and so you had to get up extra early. I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Glad to get to meet you and get to hang out. Keep up the good work.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank our viewers and listeners. I want to let you know that if you have a question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Jacob, we'll forward it to him. I'm sure he'd be willing to answer any of your questions. And we just thank you for tuning in. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.